Noir Plasma Chrome Bleed. Unlocking knowledge, inspiring innovation, empowering curious minds.
This website makes learning so easy. I found all my resources here.
Like what you share.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely reevaluate everything you thought you knew about Shinto, Japan's so-called ancient religion. We almost always hear Shinto described as this unbroken, primordial faith deeply rooted in Japan's prehistory. But what if the reality is actually far more complex, dynamic, and surprisingly modern? We're going to dive into the historical sources and data to deconstruct the myth and uncover the truly fascinating reality of this ever-evolving tradition. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with foundations, kami, and cosmos. Then, we'll move to spirits, purity, and defilement, examine the historiographical debate, take a look at the state Shinto construct, and finally wrap things up with the modern Shinto paradox. So is Shinto really Japan's ancient, unchanging religion? We often assume it's this primordial, static faith. But what if the reality is way more dynamic and historically constructed? When you look closely at the source material, it becomes immediately clear that Shinto doesn't have a single historical founder, it doesn't have a universal dogma, and there's absolutely no centralized ethical code. To understand what Shinto actually is, we first have to understand the foundational entities at its very core.
All right, Section 1, Foundations, Kami, and Cosmos.
The entire sacred focus of Shinto revolves around kami. Now, unlike omnipotent, transcendent deities in Abrahamic faiths that exist outside the universe, kami are immanent. They are active forces right here within nature. The classical definition, laid out by the Edo period scholar Moto Ori Norinaga, defines a kami as anything possessing extraordinary power that inspires sacred awe. And this is crucial. It really doesn't matter if that power is benevolent or destructive. Kami can reside in concrete things like mountains, waterfalls, and the wind, or even in human beings who have profoundly influenced society, like distinguished ancestors who were deified after they passed away. Moving on to Section 2, Spirits, Purity, and Defilement. Shinto theology tells us that kami actually possess a dynamic, dual nature. They aren't just static, moralistic beings. A kami has a nigami-tama, which is a peaceful, gentle spirit that maintains social stability and predictable agricultural growth. But they also have an arami-tama, a wild, rough spirit that manifests in sudden change, natural disasters, or violent phenomena. The arami-tama isn't evil at all, it's just raw, uncontained sacred energy. These two aspects are so distinct that they're often enshrined in completely separate architectural structures, like at the famous Ise Grand Shrine, depending on whether the community is giving thanks for peaceful prosperity or needing to invoke a radical breakthrough and pacify divine wrath. This brings us to a really brilliant contrast between Western moral sin and the Japanese concept of kagare. In Western theology, sin generally implies a moral failure or an inherent spiritual corruption. But kagare is fundamentally different. It is an amoral, temporary state of spiritual defilement or energy depletion. You don't get kagare by being a bad person. You get it simply by coming into contact with physical and existential disruptions, things like death, disease, or blood. It's really just an environmental condition that damages your spiritual health, and it has to be cleansed to maintain harmony with the kami.
So how do you fix this pollution? Well, practitioners use very specific purification rites. For kigare, they use misagi, which is an ascetic water ablution. Think of washing under a waterfall. Or harai, which involves a priest waving a purification wand. Contrast this with tsumi, which is an actual violation of social taboos or a crime. Tsumi requires societal restitution along with purification. These concepts of purity and pollution are so deeply ingrained in Japanese culture that even today people still hand out small bags of salt to mourners returning from Buddhist funerals. This allows them to ritually cleanse the kigare of death before they step back inside their own homes. Which brings us to Section 3, the historiographical debate.
In 1981, Japanese historian Kuroda Toshio dropped an absolute bombshell on the academic world. He published a study arguing that the entire concept of Shinto as an independent, ancient, indigenous religion is actually a historical illusion. He literally called it a ghost image, one created by modern scholars and Meiji-era nationalists who retroactively stitched together a bunch of historically unrelated local practices and myths. When we map this out on a historical timeline, Kuroda's point becomes incredibly clear. For over a millennium, from the medieval period onward, kami worship simply didn't exist as an independent religion. After Buddhism was introduced in the 6th century, native kami cults were fully integrated into a syncretic system called Shinbutsu Shugo. Under this doctrine, universal Buddhas were considered the original forms, and the local Japanese kami were viewed merely as their temporary manifest traces that had descended to Earth. Essentially, for 1,000 years, kami worship was structurally subordinate to Buddhism. So you're probably wondering, how did we get the independent Shinto we think of today?
Let's dive into Section 4, the state Shinto construct.
The modern creation of Shinto as a totally independent entity actually happened during the Meiji Restoration of 1868. To centralize political power around the newly reinstated emperor, the government issued an edict to forcibly decouple kami from Buddhism. And this was not a peaceful transition. It sparked a massive wave of violent anti-Buddhist iconoclasm, where thousands of temples, statues, and scriptures were outright destroyed. Out of this manufactured separation, the government constructed state Shinto. But here's the crucial part. Under Meiji law, state Shinto wasn't classified as a religion at all. Religion was viewed as a private faith. State Shinto, however, was legally framed as a mandatory, overarching civic duty and a national moral code, specifically designed to cultivate patriotism and reinforce the divine lineage of the emperor. And finally, Section 5, the modern Shinto paradox. Following World War II, state Shinto was dismantled by the Allied occupation, and religious freedom was guaranteed. But this creates an incredible sociological paradox in Japan today. Look at the national polling data for Japanese adults. A massive 62% report having absolutely no religious affiliation, and a tiny, almost negligible 3% explicitly identify as Shintoist. Looking at that, you might think Shinto is on the verge of total extinction. Yet, shockingly, the Japanese Agency for Cultural Affairs records over 107 million registered Shinto adherents. I mean, that is nearly the entire population of the country. Furthermore, behavioral metrics prove that over 80% of the Japanese population actively participates in Shinto and Buddhist rituals every single year, from New Year's shrine visits to local seasonal festivals. So how on earth can 80% of the country participate, yet only 3% actually identify as Shintoist?
This massive discrepancy is driven by an epistemological divide between the Western and Japanese concepts of religion. It really comes down to identity versus action. In modern Japan, the word for religion carries heavy connotations of formal, exclusive membership in an organized, dogmatic sect. Because Shinto lacks that universal dogma, ordinary citizens just don't view visiting a shrine for practical blessings or celebrating a seasonal festival as subscribing to a religion. Instead, they view it as normative cultural orthopraxy, which just means correct action or tradition and communal civic duty. It's entirely about communal action and behavioral engagement, not personal dogmatic identity.
Now, despite this widespread cultural participation, Shrine Shinto is definitely facing some severe headwinds. The institutional infrastructure is under intense pressure. Over 50% of active Shinto priests are over 70 years old. Coupled with severe rural depopulation, traditional parishioner networks are draining rapidly. This is leaving thousands of local shrines without resident priests and facing steadily declining financial returns. But remember, Shinto is highly adaptable. In response to all this, approximately 30% of urban shrines have adopted digital infrastructure.
They're surviving by innovating, offering things like virtual shrine tours, online prayer submissions, and digital distributions of commemorative shrine stamps, proving once again its historical capacity to completely reconfigure itself for a new era. All of this leaves us with a profound question regarding this ghost image that has continuously redefined itself over the centuries. As an incredibly adaptable system based almost entirely on physical action, ritual purity, and community orthopraxy rather than fixed spiritual belief, can Shinto successfully navigate its modern demographic crisis? Will digital prayers and virtual amulets really be enough to sustain a tradition where the people act but do not dogmatically believe? It is a fascinating paradox, and one that really redefines our very understanding of what a spiritual tradition can be. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this completely transforms how you view the ever-evolving landscape of Shinto.
Like what you shares.
This website makes learning so easy. I found all my resources here.
Noir Plasma Chrome Bleed. Unlocking knowledge, inspiring innovation, empowering curious minds.